The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host.
And I'm Drew Miller, your other host for today.
It is the 100th episode of the Habit Podcast, so I thought it'd be fun to invite producer/engineer Drew Miller in to
Absolutely.
talk about these first 99 episodes.
Hey, congratulations on your 100th episode, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Drew. Congratulations to you. I just do the fun part. I do all the talking, and I hand it over to you and now to Asher Peterson, and y'all take care of all the...
God bless Asher.
Make it magic.
Wow.
And this really is, my favorite part of my job. The podcast is my favorite thing that I do. It's just kind of doing what I like to do anyway. Talking to people I want to talk to about things we like to talk about, letting people listen in on the conversation. I feel so blessed and fortunate to be able to do that. And so in this episode, this very special episode of the Habit Podcast, we're just going to, I had asked Habit members, readers of the Habit Weekly, to give me a list of some of their favorite moments in these first 99 episodes. And so we're going to play a few of those, talk about them, and just reflect a little bit. So
yeah, excited to dive in with you.
Yeah. So when we first started, I guess about 100 weeks ago, because we hardly missed any weeks. I didn't quite know what we were biting off. And I didn't know how this was going to shape up, but I knew I didn't really want to do the Terry Gross thing, where I love Terry Gross, but where a writer of a book comes in and they just talk about what the book's about. I knew it wanted to be about writing and the writing process, but I also didn't want it to be like writing advice.
Right. Yeah. There's plenty of that.
Yeah. Right. And I guess what I knew I wanted to be about the creative process, but I guess one of my little sayings is writing issues are never just writing issues. Mm-hmm. And writing touches on all of life. And so we managed to define writing broadly enough that we ended up just kind of talking about a lot of different stuff. And so, even when we did talk about, writing advice, it always felt like we were talking about something bigger than writing advice. It's like Vesper Stamper said, hopefully I'm quoting her correctly, the work isn't everything, but everything is the work. Mm. And that certainly seemed to be the case over these first 99 episodes. And I remember one of the first episodes that we did was with Helena Sorensen.
Yeah.
And I got on the subject. I'd heard her give a talk about the idea of being thick-skinned and being thin-skinned. And it was interesting because I always until I heard Helena give this talk, I would often give writers the advice that you really need to be thick-skinned to receive criticism and benefit from it, and not take it so personally. And her thing was, hey, if I wanted to be thick-skinned, I'd go off and be a crab fisherman.
Right.
Yeah. I need you need to be thin-skinned. So I asked her about that, and here's what she said about that. Tell me about that. When you say you need thin skin, what do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I see where you're coming from, because it's important, I think, for writers to remember that they can't be held up by praise or destroyed by criticism, right? That's necessary. At the same time, I think if you wrap a thick hide around someone whose gifting is based on their sensitivity to the world, you destroy the artist. I mean, when I think of thin skin, I think of like the hairs on my arms rising up, almost a physical reaction to the atmosphere around me, to the currents in the air. And I think for artists, that's true not just of the physical environment, but of conversations, of relationships, of churches and families and cultures, that we are sensitive to shifts and changes in those things. And I had a conversation with someone recently about writers being dismissive of their work. She was bothered by that. She felt that in doing that, writers were shaming the people who were trying to praise them. And I totally understood where she was coming from. But at the same time, I was explaining, at least my perspective on that was that it was a little bit of a shield, a little bit of a self-defense of saying, please don't attack me. I know that I have failings, because that has happened in the past, and it's painful when people just really attack you and your work and what you're saying. However, I think the stronger I build my defenses, the more thick my armor against the world, the more I'm insulated from the very things that I claim to love and that I want to write about. I mean, if it's impossible for you to hurt me, it's also impossible for you to move me.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, I love the idea that you don't get a choice what to protect yourself from. If you're protecting yourself from hurt and trying to build up your sort of fortress of self-defense, you're also defending yourself against the very things you love the most. And the sensitivity that she's kind of fighting for there. It's gorgeous.
I know. Helena's just every time she opens her mouth, something wise comes out, it seems like.
Yeah.
In that same episode, she gets on the subject of being kind to yourself, and especially with regard to your past work, right? As we move forward, we tend to somehow start dismissing who we used to be. You said something that you were quoting somebody else, and you said last year's words belong to last year's language. Tell me about that. I think this is probably related to the growth mindset, but
it is, and it comes, I think, of several of the things we've been discussing, and there's a need for those of us who are writing and we're sharing our work. Sometimes there's a frustration with our early work, the first thing we did, the first thing we wrote. And, when you're growing up, you have all those awkward adolescent stages, and only your mom and your siblings have those terrible pictures to go back and laugh over. Most of the world knows you as your grown-up self.
Yeah, right.
When you've grown into your ears and your arms and legs and such, and you have the dignity of adulthood. But in writing, we sort of have to go through all those awkward adolescent stages in the public eye, and all our works are lined up on a level plane on a bookshelf.
Yeah.
As though they are all as skillfully executed as each other. And so my tendency is frustration over the early stuff. And yet, the early stuff, having done that, was how I learned to get to the later stuff. If I had skipped that portion of the journey, I wouldn't be where I am now.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to treat it with contempt and dismiss it. That poem is a portion of Eliot. Let me see. It's not the Four Loves, that's Lewis. The Four Quartets, thank you.
Okay.
Right. Last year's words belong to last year's language, and the full-fed beast shall kick the empty pail. So that I feel like sometimes that's myself. Like I've reached this point in writing, and it's easy to go back and dismiss the work that I did when I knew less and had less experience. But I don't want to do that, because the words that I had last year were the words that I had. That was the best that I had to offer. And I gave it.
Yeah.
And there's something great about that.
Yep.
You know, meager though it was, I gave it. But this year's words are new and different and maybe better than last year. And I want to give those as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I thought we were talking about writing, and we're just talking about life.
All of a sudden we're talking about being gracious to yourself and growth and maturation and all these things.
And it just happens over and over again. I think, I thought we were talking about writing, and here we are getting into some of the most basic issues of identity and who am I and how am I going to move around in the world.
Yeah, I mean, writing is so bound up in identity. I mean, even the way that Helena was just describing all of her works being on the same bookshelf right next to each other, and the vulnerability of just seeing that and knowing that they're all there for the taking. I mean, it's just
it's worse than getting
on the bookshelf. Not
it's worse than getting a tattoo. It's more permanent than a tattoo.
Yeah, I believe it.
I remember, one time when I was talking to Andy Osinga, and this is an example of, it was very practical advice. And this happens so often in this podcast, it feels like we're talking practical, and we still end up touching on these big mysteries about, inspiration and where the relationship between just sort of tending to your business and then these good things happening that you had no way of controlling. Yeah, I mean, so much of the writing work you do is just learning how to do that small percentage that's actually really good.
Yeah. And you never know when it's going to hit, right? Like, that's the thing you can't control.
Mm-hmm.
It's just is like when the magic's going to strike. And sometimes it's like it's the slog. It's the days that feel like a slog. End up, you come back to it and you go, oh, that was really good. And the days that you're super passionate and you feel great about yourself and you're just like, yeah, I'm killing this, and you're like, that was okay.
Yeah. It's like the hilarious jokes you tell in your dream, and then if you can ever remember that joke, you wake up like, that was not even funny at all.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Well, it's also, I mean, that's the world of performance, is that you play a lot of shows, you just nail a show. You play 100%. Like you not just do you hit every right note, but every little phrasing and all your timing and everything just clicks, and the audience is And then there's a night where you're forgetting words and you're just stopping and starting and you're making huge mistakes. People come up to you with tears in their eyes. I needed tonight. This was just the perfect thing for me. And you go, but I was terrible tonight. Yeah.
How do you account for that? Or can you account for that?
Well, I think we all see ourselves more in humanity than we do in perfection.
Yeah.
But also, it proves further that it's not really about us and it's not about how we present ourselves to people, and it's really about how people connect to us, and did we invite them in? And I'm so much less precious than I used to be, which is, I think, why for the first time I feel like I can bring other people in, because I realize I don't always have the best things to say, and other people have great things to say, great things to contribute. I would love their help, and I don't have to feel like I'm the contributor of every great idea for it to be good, which has definitely been something that I took a lot of pride in, having every great idea. And guess what? They're not all that great.
Man, if you can push through to selflessness or self-forgetfulness, it's like a whole new ball game.
It really is. It's so much.
It's so hard to get there.
So what's interesting to me is I hear him talking about art and craft, maybe, and the relationship between those two things, because those are categories that have been really helpful to me as well, in terms of, he's talking about how so often as a young writer, or whatever the medium is that you're working with, the thing that draws you to that discipline is the art. It's the the beauty and the ability to connect and have an outlet for your sad emotions and all this. But then the craft is the thing that takes discipline and practice, where you keep showing up in order to maybe one day meet the art again, and have that kind of descent. And so when he starts talking about these shows where, for him, one show might feel like the sort of artistic pinnacle of what he can do, and for an audience member, it's fine. But another show might feel like everything he's doing is just showing up and putting in his best, but it's not enough. And that's kind of the craft perspective. But to an audience member, that was the pinnacle of an artistic experience for them. And so, you ask, like, is there any accounting for that? And I think that's such an interesting angle on that question, because as it is a mystery of sorts, there isn't. There is no accounting for that.
Right.
But that's why it's so fascinating. That's why it's so worth discussion in the first place.
That's what I was about to say. That's why it's a conversation and not question and answer. Right.
Right.
One of the members of the Habit was talking about that exchange, and she said, I'm in my mid-30s, and I feel like that moment made me realize all the ways I hope to grow in the next couple of years. To stop performing and instead serve others. It's like a light bulb went off in my head. Oh, this is how I become a more mature artist. Praise the Lord, someone else had been through this before.
Yeah.
that just made me so happy to hear that. That this, I said something earlier about having these conversations that I want to have anyway, and then letting other people just kind of listen in on them.
Yeah. I mean, that is really a switch too that gets flipped, and in some ways you can't manufacture that flipping of that switch. You have to go through the desire to perform in order to get to the desire to serve.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's just the way we grow up.
Yeah. Speaking of good practical writing advice that's feels like more than just good practical writing advice, I loved my conversation with Hannah Anderson, who's, besides being a writer, is also a gardener, and, she loves being out in the woods.
I'll just give you a small example. Gardening teaches you that a seed has to fall into the ground and sit under the earth before it germinates.
Yeah.
And I think about my own process with my projects, or getting an idea and wanting to immediately develop it and getting stuck with it, and coming to terms with the fact that, no, that idea just needs time to germinate.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm a slacker or I haven't given enough time to it. It's that some projects and some ideas have to lie under the ground until it's time for them to sprout and come to full growth and fruition. And so it's even something as simple as that has given me the category of patience with my own creative projects. To say it's okay if I get an idea and it's not until 6 months, a year, 5 years later that it actually comes into plant and into flowering.
Yeah.
So something as simple as that really has taught me a level of patience. It also teaches you the limits of what you can do.
Right.
So you're working not just on your own, you are literally partnering with the forces around you, with creation, all under the hand of a sovereign God. And yet you are so dependent on these forces. You're dependent on the weather. You're dependent on, any kind of brokenness that would come in and steal away your work. And so for me, even within my work, I learned that writing is not just about me. It's not about whether I do sufficient work to produce something. It is about all of these other forces that I'm in partnership with, as well as ones I'd rather not be in partnership with. All of the things that are beyond me that I can't control. Even if I give myself fully and completely and do what I need to do to write a beautiful thing, there are other forces that can scuttle that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, if you don't mind, I had a thought. So there, I've read Parker Palmer talking about productivity in terms of seasons and how we are so prone to only seeing fruitfulness as above ground, visible. This thing is blossoming and yielding fruit that I can see with my eyes, and yet winter is so important, and like everything that's going on under the ground. And I just love how she's offering this fresh, more seasonal understanding of productivity. That it's liberating.
Which is also a way of talking about spiritual growth and spiritual, wisdom, which again, major recurring theme and part of it's because of the particular, not part of it, most of it is because of the authors and they're talking to. But like Randy Goodgame, let's just play some passages from that. Again, Randall, whatever he's talking about, always ends up oozing with gospel truth, and so as we were talking, he gets on the subject again. I thought we were talking about writing, but we're also talking about confidence and discipline and flourishing in all of life.
But yeah, writing out of the sort of the wellspring of freedom and the joy of getting to create without condemnation is that's a huge part of being productive, I think, because then you can just keep writing and not worrying about trusting that you're going to find the good stuff.
Yeah. Something I talk to my writing students about sometimes is confidence is not you think everything you make is good. Confidence is being able to, being confident enough to say, oh, that's not as good as it could be, right? Or this is, confidence says, this work isn't the best I've ever done, and that's okay because I'm okay. I think that's such an important idea.
Yeah.
Having the confidence to be able to not be crushed when you fail. Creativity flows out of freedom, not out of fear, not out of rigor, and yet the creative life and productivity requires discipline. We talked a little bit about the difference between discipline and legalism. When you make rules for yourself that I'm going to sit down at a certain time of day, I've got rules that I'm going to hold myself accountable to. Is that legalism? Is that something? Are you comfortable with the language of, okay, there's a little bit of legalism that's helpful in the creative life, but then you also have to have freedom and joy.
Yeah, no.
You're not comfortable with that language.
Legalism, I think, is just always bad. And so I love what you called it. It's discipline is what we need. And the rules that, because with legalism, there is always an element of earning merit.
I'm going to be justified by following these rules.
Yeah. And discipline is, a series of rules that we put together outside that whole legalistic context. It's, for flourishing, and as we are being good stewards of our gifts, which we are lifting up for the Lord to bless, or to, as an offering to Him, I don't write every day, but when I'm in a season of writing, it does help to be disciplined about being consistent, because it is hard to turn on and off the spigot, at least for me.
You used a term that is exceedingly helpful, and that is flourishing, right? We set up parameters for ourselves that will lead to flourishing. And legalism, more or less by definition, is not leading to flourishing. And I guess maybe that's the difference between rules and what we think of as legalism. Is legalism can't lead to flourishing because it is it leads to a self, proving yourself or justifying yourself or whatever that can't possibly lead to flourishing. Yeah. Whereas discipline, if the goal of discipline is flourishing, not discipline, right? I think that's, there you go. The goal of discipline is not discipline. The goal of discipline is flourishing. And if your goal is discipline, something's off. When Randall talks, it's always gospel insight, and that insight, the difference between, I have come back many times to that idea of, that discipline leads to flourishing.
Yeah. And
there's other kinds of commitment to rules that doesn't. And I've come to ask myself, this is kind of a way of being in the world for me now. Totally. Is this leading to flourishing or is it leading to something else?
Right. Yeah. And so much of that is just about good boundaries around your work and knowing what you are and what you aren't. Like, I am not this thing I'm working on. I might invest a lot of my identity and energy into a project, but that does not mean that my value as a person is dictated by the success or quality of the work.
Yeah. It's like Vesper Stamper said, the work isn't everything, even though everything is the work. Mm-hmm. I'd said a minute ago that that conversation with Randall gave me a way to be in the world. And speaking of sort of a way to be in the world, a lot of conversations over the last 99 episodes have ended up being, how do we, as responsible users of language, enter into the debates, the conversations in a fractured and fracturing culture. And Marilyn McIntyre, who's sort of a ninja in that department, had this to say.
And when I teach argumentation in writing courses, or when I have taught it, one of the things we start with is making concessions. Mm-hmm. Just how much concession can you make? Because the more you can afford to concede, the more you can recognize that another position is plausible or viable. The more generous you can be about that, the more credibility you also gain for your own position, because it says, I've arrived at my position after having sifted through a lot of things that have merit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I've found my place on that 365-degree circle. Yeah. The other thing that I resist about debate is the either-or mentality. Mm-hmm. People keep talking these days about listening to the other side. And I think we are so bifurcated politically and in so many other ways in this culture, but really there are never just two sides to every question. There are 365 sides. Yeah. Just so to resist that tendency to just polarize, I think takes some vigorous attention to the form of the conversation.
Isn't that great? The more generous you can be, the more credibility you have.
That's a complete 180 from the way that discourse happens in our culture at the moment.
Yeah.
I love how completely, just opposite that perspective is.
Yeah. One thing that I've learned through these 99 episodes is that when we think of, the creative process, I've learned to stop thinking of it. I don't guess I really did think of it as here are 5 steps to creative success, but what I keep hearing over and over from writers is the idea that you just sort of wade in and then figure out your process after you've waded in. That the journey is not, what's the word? I mean, it's how journeys go. You start, and a journey in the dark, you can't see beyond your headlights, but you can see to the next curve.
The map is not reality.
Right.
And you'll learn that by engaging with reality.
Yeah. So this is Lisa Deem, who wrote a book about pilgrimages.
For me, I need to have some general idea. I won't start a big project unless I have an idea of where I'm going. But also, once I get in the middle, I realize I didn't know where I was going.
Yes.
and to embrace that, and to be willing to, what's the word I'm looking for? To be willing to not just accept, but embrace that truth, really leaves me open to write something better than I had in mind, than what I had in mind at the beginning.
Oh, I agree with that, both for writing and the spiritual life, that it's one of the paradoxes or tensions of pilgrimage that I've learned to embrace, which is we do know where we're going, at least in life, but at the same time, we don't know. As Thomas Merton said, I have no idea where I'm going. And that it is a tension, and I used to want to really try to resolve that tension, but that's what the path is, and you don't know. And that's what makes everyone's path also be different and unique. It's not like it's a formula.
Yeah.
But to embrace the uncertainty in writing too. I'm a big outliner. I just like to have things, just really set out. And in this book, I had it pretty set out because I knew I wanted to follow Pilgrim's journey step by step. So I had the structure. I want to follow them to Jerusalem every step of the way. But I was still surprised in the middle. There were plenty of surprises. I ended up adding a chapter that I hadn't planned. There's always a surprise. And I think we do right to find out what we want to say, or to wrestle with our faith, and that we don't always know where it's going to go. Yeah,
right. A map is a very different thing from a journey, right? When any journey can be diagrammed on a map, but that's very different from seeing the mountains or facing the robbers or whatever it is that happens on that journey.
Right. You don't know when you're right there. You can't see over the Alps.
And then, Tish Harrison Warren, she's actually been on twice now because she's written 2 books since we started. She said something, it's kind of the same thing in a different way.
Someone interviewed me for a podcast recently, and sort of we were talking about this question of, how do you trust God if you can't trust God for bad things happening? And he said, what was your answer, kind of thing? And I was like, I didn't have an answer. And he said, well, then how'd you write the book? And I realized, oh, no, that I don't. When I write a book, I don't have a question, sit down, totally come up with the answer, write it in outline form, decide what to say, and then sit down and write the answer. I answer the question by writing the book. This was part of the way I understand this book is it was a book. I didn't want to write this book. I actually was sitting down to write a different book and ended up sort of feeling like I had to write this book. And part of that for me was that this was the question I was avoiding. What I was wrestling with was how to trust God, and it was a question I was using all kinds of things from distraction to theology to get around and not have to deal with. And so it really took me writing 70, 80,000 words on this, reading a ton on this, and then taking those 70, 80,000 words and editing them and changing them and down to about 40,000, then sending that to an editor, having them interact with it, get back to me with questions and changes. I had to go through that whole process to be able to, where I feel settled, to be able to learn to trust God again, honestly, and to be able to sort of know truth that I didn't know. I really do think that writers and other makers, I think with my hands. So I don't decide, and Madeline Lingle talked about this too. I don't decide what to say and then write it down. I find out what I think and believe by writing it down, if that makes sense.
I love that because I'm a verbal processor. And so to me that there's like a visceral way in which that makes sense. Like I'm talking right now and I have no idea what's about to come out of my mouth, but I will come to understand my own thoughts and like how I see reality by talking.
Yeah.
And I feel like in some ways writing, I mean, you're kind of doing that, and not that everybody's, the same kind of processing, but by putting pen to paper, you are making yourself vulnerable to the changing of your mind.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. We don't have Doug McKelvey queued up, but there's he talks about it. It was funny. He said there's a joke. Someone has a face for radio. He says I have a thought process that's not for podcasting. That's what Doug said about himself, because he said I start a sentence and I don't know how I'm going to finish it, and it takes me as I start the sentence. And then I start looking for what rhymes to finish that idea. I put out the subject and the predicate, and then hopefully by the time I get to the object, I know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, and that makes so much sense with his Every Moment Holy liturgies. I mean, just thinking about that way of thinking, and how it. I just picture his liturgies as these streams of riffing like that.
Yeah, right.
Oftentimes I will take so many runs at a sentence because I get the first part of the thought down, and then it can be this laborious process of, okay, what's the next, where does this lead? What's the next logical or the next poetic aesthetic phrase, or where is this going? And only when I get to the end of it finally and can put the period on that sentence can I then step back and look at it and say, okay, is this working? Is it working on every level?
Yeah.
In terms of meaning and aesthetic, and then adjust it from there. But yeah, I think it's part of why writing is a paralyzing process to me so often, is because I'm afraid of that unknown, even down to the level of a sentence. Yes.
But it seems to me we're talking about a walk of faith here, so to speak, that a trust that if I launch into this, because, well, you tell me if you think this is true. Does everything rhyme with everything? Anyway, in some sense. In other words, if I launch into this thing, I'm going to find what it rhymes with, although it may not be on the first try.
I would say yes, with some caveat, because I think that everything that is true rhymes with everything that is true. Mm-hmm. Or maybe we could say everything that is true, good, beautiful, rhymes with everything that is true, good, beautiful.
Yeah.
So certainly I think there are ideas we could express that, whether it's the aesthetic level or the level of morality or theology, where we experience a dissonance in works of art that we encounter, whether it's writing or a movie or whatever it might be. Because we recognize that's not lining up with reality, with what I know to be true. That's not, this is elevating what is degraded, rather than, elevating what is good and right and commendable. So all things as they should be do rhyme with one another, right? But our ears become trained and our consciences become trained to recognize that dissonance.
This isn't exactly a stopping place, but we aren't even halfway through these clips that we've selected to talk about. So why don't we just wrap up here for this week, pick it up right here again next week.
Yep, so much goodness.
So much goodness.
Can't wait to dive back in.
Sounds good.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.